The outpost on Sector 9 was a lonely, dusty place. It was a small military base on the edge of the galaxy, surrounded by red rocks and constant wind. The soldiers stationed there were from many different planets. Most were strong, with 4 arms or thick scales, and they loved to brag about their battles. Among them was Kale, a tall, blue-skinned officer who believed that war was a game of logic and strength. Then there was Arthur. Arthur was a human. In a base full of warriors, Arthur was an anomaly. He wasn't a soldier. He was a medic. He didn't carry a heavy plasma rifle, and he didn't have any scars. He was a small man with graying hair and a soft voice. While the other soldiers spent their free time cleaning their guns, Arthur spent his time in a small, homemade greenhouse, growing tomatoes and roses from earth. Kale and Arthur were partners. Every day they patrolled the dusty perimeter together. To Kale, Arthur seemed weak. The human would often stop to look at the sunset or help a small, local animal that had injured its wing. Arthur, Kale would say, his voice full of frustration, "Why do you waste your time? This is a war zone. You should be practicing your aim. The galaxy is a cruel place, and being soft will get you killed." Arthur would just smile, a kind, gentle smile that made his eyes wrinkle at the corners. "The world is already full of fire, Kale," Arthur would say. "Someone has to remember how to plant flowers. Besides, I am a man of peace. I've seen enough blood to last 10 lifetimes. I'd rather be a gardener." The other soldiers mocked him. They called him the human flower and the soft medic. They thought humanity had sent their weakest link to Sector 9. They didn't understand that the most dangerous thing about a human isn't their gun, it's their patience. The peace of Sector 9 ended on a Tuesday. The sky didn't turn dark with ships. Instead, it turned white with a strange, holy light. The immortals had arrived. In the galaxy, the immortals were spoken of in whispers. They were a race of ancient beings who believed they were gods. They had golden skin, glowing eyes, and technology that looked like magic. They didn't just conquer planets, they erased them. The attack was over in minutes. The outpost shields, which were supposed to last for hours, melted instantly under the immortals' golden beams. The alien soldiers, so proud of their strength, were crushed. Kale was knocked to the ground, his blue skin covered in dust and blood. As the smoke cleared, the immortal commander stepped into the center of the base. He was tall, beautiful, and terrifying. He looked at the cowering soldiers with total disgust. Behind him, his golden guards held the survivors at gunpoint. Among the survivors was Kale, Arthur, and a young recruit named Pip. Pip was a small, feathered alien who was only 18 years old. He was crying, his small wings shaking with fear. The immortal commander walked over to Pip. He lifted the young recruit by his throat with one hand. "You are all so small," the commander said, his voice sounding like beautiful music. "You are just bugs in the garden of the gods, and bugs must be stepped on." Arthur stepped forward. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't even have his medical kit. He just stood there in his dirty uniform looking at the golden god. "Please," Arthur said. His voice was steady, but there was a strange, low vibration in it. "He is just a child. He hasn't done anything to you. Take me instead, or just take our supplies and leave. There is no need for this." The immortal commander turned his glowing eyes to Arthur. He laughed. It was a cold, beautiful sound. "The human medic wants to be a hero. I've heard about your species. You are the peacemakers. You are the ones who turned your swords into plowshares. You are nothing but sheep." The commander looked back at Pip. He smiled, and with a casual flick of his wrist, he used his psychic power to snap the young recruit's neck. Pip's body fell to the dust like a broken doll. The base went silent. Kale felt his heart sink. He expected Arthur to scream. He expected Arthur to cry or run away, but Arthur didn't move. Kale looked at his partner. Something was happening. The air around Arthur began to shimmer, not with light, but with heat. The human's gentle face didn't twist in anger. Instead, it went perfectly flat. The kindness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, dark void that seemed to swallow the light. Arthur took a breath. It was a long, slow breath that sounded like the wind moving through a graveyard. Kale realized that the soft medic was gone. In his place stood something ancient, something that had been sleeping for a long time. Arthur didn't look like a gardener anymore. He looked like a hunter who had just found his prey. "Commander," Arthur said. His voice was different now. It was no longer soft. It was the sound of a mountain cracking. "I told you I was a man of peace. I told you I wanted to be a gardener." Arthur stepped toward the golden god. The immortal gods raised their rifles, but they hesitated. For the first time in their lives, they felt something they didn't have a word for: instinctive fear. "But the thing about gardeners," Arthur whispered, his eyes locking onto the commander's, "is that we know exactly how to pull the weeds." The immortal commander laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. "What can you do, human? You have no gun. You are alone." Arthur looked at his empty hands. Then he looked at the commander. "I'm not alone," he said. "I have 1,000,000 years of monsters behind me." "And you just woke them all up." Cale watched, frozen on the ground, as Arthur reached for a simple rusty metal pipe lying in the dirt. At that moment, Cale realized that the galaxy didn't fear humans because they were strong. The galaxy feared them because of what happened when they finally truly broke. The cliffhanger was set. The soft human was gone, and the gods were about to learn why they should have stayed in the heavens. The immortal commander did not move. He was a being of pure energy and golden light, a creature who had lived for thousands of years. To him, the human standing in the dust was nothing more than an ant. But as he looked into Arthur's eyes, the commander felt a strange, cold shiver. It was a feeling he had not felt in an eon. It was the feeling of being hunted. "Kill him," the commander ordered, his voice echoing with divine power. "End this joke now." Two golden guards stepped forward. They moved with a grace that was beautiful to see. Their rifles were sleek and white, firing beams of pure heat that could melt a tank. They pointed their weapons at Arthur's chest and fired. Cale closed his eyes. He didn't want to see his friend die. He waited for the sound of the explosion, the sound of Arthur being turned into ash. But instead he heard a sound like a heavy whip cracking through the air. Snap! Cale opened his eyes and gasped. Arthur was no longer standing in the same spot. He had moved with a speed that the alien eyes could barely follow. He hadn't ducked or hidden. He had simply tilted his body, the golden beam missing his shoulder by an inch. Arthur was now standing directly in front of the first guard. The human looked tiny compared to the 7-foot-tall immortal, but Arthur didn't look up. He looked through the guard. With a movement so fast it was a blur, Arthur grabbed the barrel of the golden rifle. The immortal guard was strong, but Arthur's grip was like a hydraulic press. There was a sickening sound of metal being crushed. Arthur didn't pull the gun away. He twisted it. The beautiful white weapon snapped in half as if it were made of dry sticks. Before the guard could react, Arthur's hand moved again. He didn't punch. He struck with the palm of his hand, hitting the guard in the center of his golden chest plate. The sound was like a hammer hitting an anvil. The immortal guard, a being of divine strength, was lifted off his feet and sent flying backward. He crashed into a stone wall 50 feet away. The golden armor shattered into 1,000 pieces. The base fell into a terrifying silence. The other soldiers, both the aliens and the immortals, stopped breathing. No one had ever seen a human move like that. No one had ever seen a soft medic destroy a god with his bare hands. "What are you?" the immortal commander whispered. His glowing eyes flickered with confusion. "You are just a medic. You are a man of peace." Arthur didn't answer. He didn't even look at the commander yet. He turned his head slowly toward the second guard. The guard was shaking. He raised his rifle, his finger trembling on the trigger. "Stay back," the guard screamed. "I am an immortal. I am a son of the stars." Arthur took a step forward. Crunch. His boot crushed a piece of Pip's broken armor on the ground. The sound seemed to echo through the entire canyon. "You keep using that word," Arthur said. His voice was a low, dangerous growl. "Immortal. You think it means you can't die. You think it means you are above the laws of the universe." Arthur took another step. The second guard fired, but his aim was off. The beam hit the ground near Arthur's feet, sending up a cloud of red dust. Arthur walked through the dust like a ghost. "But on my world," Arthur continued, his voice getting colder with every word, "we have a different word for things that think they are gods. We call them targets. We spent 1,000,000 years fighting things much bigger than you. We fought the cold, the dark, and the beasts of the forest. We fought until we were the only ones left. And then because we were so good at killing, we fought ourselves. The god tried to run, but Arthur was faster. He caught the god by the back of his golden neck. There was no struggle. There was no long battle. There was only the sound of a predator finishing its work. Arthur didn't use a weapon. He didn't need one. He used the strength that had been hidden under his skin for 60 years, the strength of a species that had survived a death world. Cale watched from the ground, his blue eyes wide with terror. He realized that everything Arthur had told him was a lie. Arthur wasn't a gardener because he was soft. He was a gardener because he was dangerous. He had chosen to plant flowers because he knew that if he ever stopped, the monster inside him would take over. The immortal commander was now alone. His gods were broken heaps of gold in the dust. He raised his hands, and a ball of golden energy began to form between his palms. It was a god bolt, a weapon that could level a city block. Enough, the commander roared. I will erase you from existence, human. I will burn your soul. Arthur didn't stop walking. He didn't even raise his hands to protect his face. He looked at the glowing ball of energy as if it were nothing more than a toy. The boy you killed, Arthur said softly. His name was Pip. He liked to sing. He wanted to see Earth one day. Who cares about a bug? The commander screamed, throwing the god bolt. The explosion was massive. A wave of heat and light washed over the base, knocking Cale backward. The red dust was so thick that no one could see anything. The immortals in the ships above watched the screens, waiting for the human to be gone. But as the dust began to settle, a silhouette appeared. Arthur was still standing. His uniform was torn and his skin was scorched, but he didn't seem to feel the pain. He was holding the rusty metal pipe he had picked up earlier. It was glowing red from the heat of the explosion, but Arthur's grip was steady. My turn, Arthur whispered. For the first time in 10,000 years, an immortal commander turned and ran. He ran toward his ship, his heart pounding against his ribs. He realized that the humans hadn't sent their weakest link to Sector 9. They had sent the one man who was strong enough to keep the monster in the cage. And now, the cage was broken. The immortal commander reached the ramp of his scout ship, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He had conquered galaxies. He had lived through the birth of stars, but as he scrambled into the cockpit of his vessel, he felt like a child running from a monster in the dark. He punched the ignition sequence, his golden fingers shaking against the touch-sensitive controls. Close the hatch, he screamed at the ship's computer. Launch now, destroy the base, burn everything. But the hatch didn't close. Instead, there was a sound of groaning metal. Cale, watching from the dirt of the base, saw Arthur reach the ramp just as it began to lift. The human didn't jump. He didn't dive. He simply grabbed the edge of the rising metal ramp with his bare hands. The hydraulics of the god-tier ship hissed and whined, trying to force the door shut. The machinery was strong enough to crush a boulder, but Arthur stood his ground. His muscles bunched under his torn shirt, and his veins stood out like thick ropes on his neck. With a roar that sounded more like a storm than a man, Arthur pulled. The heavy metal ramp didn't just stop. It bent. The hinges snapped with a sound like a cannon firing. Arthur ripped the entire ramp off the ship and tossed it aside as if it were a piece of cardboard. He stepped into the glowing white interior of the immortal ship, his shadow stretching long and dark across the pristine golden floors. Stay back, a voice cried from inside. 3 more immortal guards rushed the hallway. They were the commander's personal shield bearers. They activated their energy blades, glowing swords of blue light that could cut through a mountain. They swung at Arthur with perfect, practiced movements. Arthur didn't even blink. He entered what Cale would later describe as the berserker state. It wasn't a blind rage. It wasn't a wild, messy fight. It was a terrifying, quiet efficiency. Arthur moved through the energy blades as if he were dancing. He moved between the swings, his body swaying just inches away from the deadly light. Every time a guard swung, Arthur was already somewhere else. He struck the first guard with the rusty metal pipe. The blow didn't just hit the armor, it caved it in. The immortal god was sent spinning into the wall, his divine energy blade flickering out. Arthur didn't stop to watch him fall. He grabbed the second god's wrist and squeezed. The sound of gold snapping was followed by the god dropping his sword. Arthur caught the energy blade before it hit the floor and in one fluid motion deactivated it and used the heavy hilt to knock the god unconscious. He didn't use the aliens' weapons to kill. He used them to humiliate. He wanted them to know that their magic and their technology meant nothing to a human who had lost his patience. The third god tried to use a psychic blast, a wave of mental energy designed to paralyze the brain. Cale felt the pressure of the wave even from outside the ship. It was a weight that felt like being underwater. But Arthur didn't slow down. He walked through the psychic wave as if it were a light breeze. He reached the god, looked him in the eyes, and simply head-butted the golden helmet. The god collapsed instantly. The human was a whirlwind of movement. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't crying. He was just working. To Arthur, this wasn't a glorious battle. It was a chore. It was the cleaning he had spoken of. He was pulling weeds from his garden, and he was doing it with the cold focus of a professional. Inside the cockpit, the commander watched the internal cameras in horror. He saw his best warriors falling like dry leaves. He saw the human medic, the man who grew tomatoes, walking through a hail of fire without a scratch on his soul. "Computer, overload the engines," the commander shouted. "If I cannot leave, I will take this whole sector with me. Self-destruction in 60 seconds, the computer's calm voice replied. Cale heard the warning from the base. He tried to stand up, his blue legs shaking. "Arthur," he yelled, "the ship is going to explode. Get out of there. You've won. Please, Arthur, come back." But Arthur didn't come back. He reached the cockpit doors. They were reinforced with diamond-layered steel. Arthur didn't look for a key. He raised the rusty pipe, the only weapon he had brought from the dirt, and began to hit the door. Clang, clang, clang. With every hit, the guards on the ships orbiting the planet watched their sensors in disbelief. They saw the heat signature of a single human rising to impossible levels. It wasn't the heat of a fire. It was the heat of a biological system pushed to the absolute limit. Arthur's heart was beating 400 times a minute. His blood was a cocktail of natural adrenaline and ancestral fury. The door began to buckle. The diamond steel was cracking. The immortal commander fell back against his pilot's chair. He realized that the humans hadn't lied about being peaceful. They had been telling the truth because they were the only ones who knew how scary the alternative was. They were peaceful because they had to be. Crack! The door flew off its tracks. Arthur stepped into the cockpit. He was covered in sweat and red dust. His eyes were no longer Arthur's eyes. They were the eyes of a wolf from the ancient forests of Earth. They were the eyes of a species that had looked at the cold, empty universe and decided to survive anyway. 30 seconds to self-destruction, the computer announced. Arthur looked at the commander. He didn't raise his pipe. He didn't growl. He just pointed to the young recruit's body lying in the dirt far below. "You called us bugs," Arthur said. His voice was so quiet it was scarier than any scream. "You thought we were sheep. But the thing about sheep is that they only exist because the shepherd is there to protect them. And today, I'm not the shepherd." The commander looked at the timer. 10 seconds. He looked at Arthur and saw a man who didn't care if he lived or died as long as the job was done. At that moment, the god realized the ultimate truth. You can fight a soldier, you can fight a king, but you can never, ever win against a human who has stopped caring about the cost. The countdown reached 5 seconds. Inside the cockpit, the immortal commander closed his eyes, waiting for the end. He was a being of light, but even light is extinguished in a fusion blast. He expected to die in a flash of heat. He expected the human to die with him, but Arthur did not wait for the explosion. With a strength that seemed to come from the core of the planet itself, Arthur grabbed the commander by his golden robes. He didn't use his hands to strike. He used them to launch. With a massive heave, Arthur threw the commander through the shattered cockpit window, sending the god tumbling into the red dust of the planet below. Then Arthur turned to the ship's central power core. 3, 2, 1. The explosion was not a ball of fire. Because it was an immortal ship, the self-destruction was a wave of pure golden energy. It expanded outward, a dome of blinding light that swallowed the ship and the landing pad. Cale, watching from behind a rock, shielded his eyes. "Arthur!" he screamed, his voice lost in the roar of the blast. The shockwave hit the base, knocking over the remaining walls and sending a cloud of red dust miles into the air. When the light finally faded, there was nothing left of the ship but a glowing crater of melted gold. Cale stood up, his blue skin pale with grief. He looked at the crater. No biological creature could survive a fusion overload at point-blank range, not even a human. But then the dust began to swirl. It wasn't the wind. It was a rhythmic, pulsing movement. High above the immortal fleet, thousands of golden ships stayed perfectly still. Their sensors were locked onto the crater. Their computers were screaming. They were detecting a life sign. It shouldn't have been possible, but a single heart was still beating at the center of the explosion. Thump, 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 thump. From the center of the melted gold, a hand reached out. It was a human hand, but it was glowing with a strange, angry heat. Arthur stepped out of the fire. His clothes were almost gone. His skin was blackened by the blast, and blood ran down his face from a dozen cuts. But he was standing. He wasn't standing because he was lucky. He was standing because of the ancestral rage. In that moment, Cale understood the secret of the human race. When a human truly breaks, they tap into a part of their brain that has been hidden for millions of years. It is a state where the body ignores the laws of pain and the limits of muscles. It is the survival override. On Earth, mothers had lifted cars to save their children. On Sector 9, Arthur was lifting the weight of an entire species' history. Arthur didn't look at Cale. He didn't look at the defeated commander groaning in the dirt. He looked up. He looked at the thousands of golden ships in the sky. He looked at the gods who were watching him through their telescopes and cameras. Arthur reached down and picked up the rusty metal pipe. It had been forged in the heat of the explosion. It was now a jagged spike of blackened steel. He raised the pipe toward the sky. It wasn't a salute. It was a challenge. Suddenly, the intercom systems on every ship in the immortal fleet hissed to life. Arthur wasn't using a radio. The sheer intensity of the berserker state was causing his bioelectric field to interfere with the ship's electronics. His voice didn't come through the speakers. It came as a vibration in the aliens' own minds. "Is this all you have?" Arthur's voice whispered in the heads of 10 million immortals. It was a voice filled with the shadows of Earth's darkest nights. "You call yourselves gods because you can burn a planet. But we are humans because we can survive the fire. You killed a child today. You broke the peace." Arthur took a step forward, his feet cracking the melted gold under him. "My people have spent centuries trying to forget the taste of blood," Arthur continued, his voice growing louder, vibrating the glass of the ships in orbit. "We made gardens so we wouldn't have to make graves. But you wanted to see the old ways. You wanted to see the monsters." In the fleet above, the High Admiral of the Immortals felt a cold terror. He looked at his tactical map. A single red dot, Arthur, was causing the energy readings of the entire planet to spike. "Target him," the Admiral shouted. "Fire the orbital beams. Erase that spot from the map." The golden ships began to glow. They prepared to fire a beam of light that could crack a continent, but before they could pull the trigger, Arthur did something that made the gods finally scream. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He began to sing. It wasn't a beautiful song. It was a low, guttural chant. It was an old human war song, a rhythm from a time before ships, before electricity, when humans sat around fires and promised to kill the things in the dark. As Arthur sang, the red dust around him began to rise. The bioelectric field around him grew so strong that the air began to crackle with blue lightning. The orbital beams fired. A massive pillar of golden light hit Arthur directly. The planet shook. The mountains groaned. Cale hid his face, waiting for the world to end. When the light cleared, Arthur was still there. He had jammed the rusty pipe into the ground, using it as a lightning rod. The golden energy of the gods had been sucked into the soil, leaving Arthur standing in the center of a glass-filled circle. He stopped singing. He looked up at the fleet, and for the first time he smiled. It was a terrifying smile. It was the smile of a species that had realized their enemy was not a god, but just another thing that could bleed. "My turn," Arthur whispered again. He didn't need a ship. He didn't need a gun. He simply began to walk toward the commander's communication array. The gods realized too late that they hadn't trapped a human on a planet. They had trapped themselves in a galaxy with a human who had finally remembered how to hunt. Gale watched as Arthur reached the array. The human didn't send a plea for help to Earth. He sent a single signal to every human colony in the galaxy. It wasn't a long message. It was just one word, repeated over and over. "Awake." The galaxy shivered, because for the first time in 300 years, the gardeners were putting down their shovels and looking for their swords. The word "awake" did not just travel through the airwaves. It seemed to travel through the very fabric of reality. On the immortal flagship, the Light of Ages, the High Admiral watched as his screens turned from golden white to a deep blood red. The message was hitting every human ship, every human colony, and every human heart. But on Sector 9, the immediate problem was much more local. The problem was Arthur. The immortal commander, who had been thrown into the dirt, was trying to crawl away. His golden robes were stained with red mud. He looked back and saw Arthur standing by the communication array. The human skin was still glowing with the heat of the orbital strike, but he looked as calm as if he were back in his greenhouse. "You are insane," the commander hissed, his voice trembling. "You sent a signal to your people. What can they do? We have the fleet. We have the power of the stars. You are just one man." Arthur didn't look at the commander. He looked at the sky. He watched as the golden ships above began to move in circles, their formation breaking. "You keep talking about power," Arthur said quietly, "but you don't understand what power is. Power isn't a ship. Power isn't a beam of light. Power is the ability to endure. And humans, we are very, very good at enduring." Suddenly, the Light of Ages began to shake. From the surface of the planet, Cale could see small, black specks rising from the craters around the human base. They weren't missiles. They were old industrial mining drones. They were slow, clunky, and rusted. Normally, the immortal shields would have ignored them, but these drones were being guided by Arthur's bioelectric field. He was using the communication array as a giant remote control, funneling his ancestral rage into the machines. The drones didn't fire lasers. They simply accelerated. They became hundreds of iron bullets, moving with the desperate speed of a human heartbeat. "Destroy them," the High Admiral shouted from the flagship. "Use the secondary batteries." The golden ships began to fire, but the drones were too small and too many. They began to slam into the golden hulls of the immortal fleet. Each impact was like a hammer hitting a bell. The divine shields of the immortals were designed to stop heat and energy, but they weren't designed to stop 5 tons of rusted iron moving at 10,000 miles per hour. As the ships above began to burn, the immortal commander on the ground realized the truth. Arthur wasn't just a man anymore. He had become a hub, a central processor for the entire sector's technology. His rage had turned the very tools of the base into weapons. The commander tried to stand up, his golden eyes glowing with a desperate light. He raised his hands to fire one last psychic blast. He poured every ounce of his immortal soul into a wave of mental energy. "Die, you primitive beast," he roared. The psychic wave hit Arthur like a physical wall. The air between them distorted, and the ground cracked. Cale felt the mental pressure and fell to his knees, his mind screaming in pain. But Arthur didn't move. He didn't even blink. He took the psychic hit, his feet sliding back only an inch in the red dirt. He looked at the commander, and for the first time he spoke with a voice that wasn't a whisper. "Is that all?" Arthur asked. He walked forward, stepping through the psychic pressure as if it were a light rain. He reached the commander and grabbed the alien's glowing hands. The golden energy hissed against Arthur's burned skin, but the human didn't let go. He slowly forced the commander's hands down. "I have felt the cold of the Atlantic Ocean," Arthur said, his eyes boring into the commander's. I have felt the heat of a desert sun. I have felt the grief of losing everyone I ever loved. Your little mind trick is nothing compared to a Tuesday on Earth. Arthur squeezed. There was a sound of breaking gold and a scream that echoed through the canyon. The god fell to his knees, his power extinguished. The High Admiral, watching from above, felt a fear so deep it made his golden scales turn a dull, sickly gray. He looked at his tactical map. The human signal awake had reached Earth, and Earth had answered. Admiral, a bridge officer cried out. Long-range sensors are picking up thousands of signatures. They are coming from every direction. Whose fleet is it? The Admiral demanded. The human military. The Federation? No, sir, the officer replied, his voice breaking. It's everyone. It's human cargo ships. It's human transport buses. It's human fishing vessels. They've all turned around. They've all armed themselves with whatever they have. They are coming for us. The Admiral looked at the screen. Thousands of tiny, weak human ships were jumping into the system. They didn't have golden shields. They didn't have guide bolts, but they had the same look in their eyes that Arthur had. They were a species that had finally had enough. On the ground, Arthur looked up at the arriving human ships. The red light in his eyes began to fade, replaced by a deep, heavy exhaustion. He looked at Cale and gave a small, tired nod. The garden is ruined, Arthur whispered, looking at his burned roses and the melted greenhouse. It's going to take a long time to fix it. Arthur, Cale said, rushing over to his friend. You saved us. You defeated the gods. Arthur sat down in the red dirt, his body finally beginning to shake from the massive adrenaline crash. He looked at his hands, the hands that had just dismantled an empire. We aren't gods, Cale, Arthur said, his voice returning to the soft, gentle tone he always used. We are just humans. And the galaxy should be very glad that we try so hard to be peaceful, because once we stop, there is no one who can put the monster back in the cage. The immortal commander looked up at the sky, watching his once mighty fleet being swarmed by thousands of angry human sheep. He realized that the immortals had lived for 10,000 years, but they had never truly understood the universe. They thought power was about being eternal, but as he looked at the tired, bleeding humans sitting in the dirt, he finally learned the lesson. Power is about being mortal, but refusing to stay down. The gods were falling, and the gardeners were just getting started with the cleanup. The War of the Gods lasted exactly 4 hours. It didn't end with a grand treaty or a dramatic surrender. It ended because the immortal fleet simply ceased to exist. Thousands of golden ships were torn apart by human cargo haulers, mining ships, and even private yachts. The humans didn't use fancy tactics. They simply rammed their ships into the golden hulls, boarded them with welding torches and kitchen knives, and fought until there was nothing left but scrap metal. When the last immortal ship exploded in the sky like a dying star, a heavy silence returned to Sector 9. The Galactic Council arrived 2 days later. They sent their most expensive medical ships and their most decorated diplomats. They expected to find a planet full of celebrating soldiers and a human hero standing on a mountain of bodies. Instead, they found a small, quiet man in a dirty, burned uniform sitting in the middle of a ruined garden. Arthur was back in his greenhouse, or what was left of it. The glass had been blown out and the plants were mostly ash. But Arthur was there, on his knees in the red dirt, carefully replanting a single charred rose bush. His hands were still bandaged and his face was scarred, but his eyes were soft again. The red glow was gone. The monster had gone back to sleep. Cale stood at the edge of the garden, watching the council members approach. They walked slowly, their many eyes wide with fear. They didn't look at the destroyed immortal ships in the distance. They looked at Arthur. Is that him? One of the counselors whispered, his voice trembling. The one who broke the High Admiral's mind. The one who dismantled an immortal god ship with a piece of pipe. That is Arthur, Cale said, his voice full of a pride that was mixed with a deep, dark respect. But be careful. He is busy. The head of the council, a wise and ancient being with many tentacles, stepped forward. Human, he called out, we have come to thank you. You have saved the galaxy from the immortal tyranny. We wish to award you the Medal of Eternal Honor. We wish to build a monument in your name." Arthur didn't look up from his rose bush. He gently patted the soil around the roots. "I don't want a medal," Arthur said. His voice was quiet and tired. "And I don't want a monument. I just want some seeds. The immortals stepped on my tomatoes. It's going to be a hard winter." The counselors looked at each other, confused. They couldn't understand. They had seen the recordings. They had seen this man move like a demon. They had seen him walk through a fusion blast. And here he was, worried about tomatoes. "You don't understand," the counselor said. "The galaxy is changed. The gods are gone. You are the most powerful warrior we have ever seen. You could rule this sector." Arthur finally stood up. He wiped the dirt from his hands and looked the counselor in the eye. The counselor immediately stepped back, his tentacles curling in fear. Even though Arthur was smiling, there was something behind his eyes that felt like looking into the heart of a volcano. "You think I'm a warrior?" Arthur asked softly. "I'm not. I'm a man who spent 60 years trying to forget how to be a warrior. My people spent 1,000 years trying to become gardeners. Do you know why?" The counselor shook his head. "Because we know what we are," Arthur said. He pointed to the sky, where the wreckage of the immortal fleet was still falling like shooting stars. "We know that inside every one of us is a beast that doesn't know how to stop. We know that if we give in to that rage, we lose our souls. We plant flowers because if we don't, we will plant graves." Arthur stepped closer to the council members. "The galaxy looks at us and sees peaceful neighbors. They see merchants and medics. They see people who like to sing and dance, and we want you to keep seeing that, but don't ever mistake our kindness for a lack of teeth." The human looked back at his ruined garden. "The day I broke was a bad day for the immortals, but it was a worse day for me, because now, every time I close my eyes, I remember the sound of the snap. I remember the smell of the blood. I remember how easy it was." Arthur looked back at the counselors, and for a second the red light flickered in his eyes, just for a heartbeat. "Go home. Tell the galaxy to stay away from our gardens. Tell them that the humans are very, very kind, and that they should pray we stay that way." The council left Sector 9 that same hour. They didn't build a monument. Instead, they built a wall of no-fly zones around every human colony. They updated their records, moving humanity from the peaceful list to a category of their own. The folder was simply titled, "The Silent Predators." Below the title, they added a note for future generations. "If you see a human planting flowers, let them. If you see them smiling, smile back. But if you see a human stop smiling, run. Run as far as you can. Because once the gardener puts down the shovel and picks up the sword, even the gods cannot save you." Cale stayed on Sector 9 with Arthur. They didn't talk about the war. They didn't talk about the immortals. They just worked in the garden. And every evening, as the sun set over the red rocks, Cale would watch Arthur. The human would sit on a bench, looking at his roses, his hands steady and gentle. But Cale noticed that Arthur never threw away that rusty metal pipe. He kept it leaning against the wall of the greenhouse, a dark, blackened reminder of what happened when the world forced a good man to be a monster. Cale looked at the camera, the audience, and delivered the final lesson. "People ask me why I'm so afraid of humans," Cale whispered. "They say humans are the nicest people in the stars, and I tell them they are right. They are the nicest, kindest, most wonderful people you will ever meet, but I have seen what happens when they break, and now I don't look at their smiles anymore. I look at their hands, and I pray to whatever gods are left that those hands never have to stop planting flowers."